Welcome to episode 96. I'm here with Marcelo.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you having me here on your podcast.
Amazing, amazing, for sure. And can you let the listeners and audience members know a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So basically, I'm based out of Florida, the United States. I am a life coach. I specialize in self love. Prior to that, I've been an entrepreneur on the internet since 1999.
Wow.
That has always been my major business. So it's a passion that I've enjoyed for a long time. I was involved in music and then carried on over to marketing, and that's pretty much it. So, but my true passion has always been in personal growth for myself and for people around me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So let's go a little bit back in time and let's go down under memory lane. Can you tell us a little bit about how childhood was like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a beautiful childhood. Obviously, I don't think any childhood is perfect, right?
Yeah,
But um, I I had I have two beautiful parents. As parents, they were always excellent for my sister and I. So in regards to that matter, we always had like a beautiful relationship and a beautiful upbringing. Unfortunately, they just didn't have a good marriage, you know.
that's the
So
sucky part.
that's kind of where
Yeah,
things got thrown into the mix, which at that time maybe sometimes we don't realize it, but as we get older, we see or we become aware of how things that we dealt with in our childhood affected us as we grew into adulthood. You
it
know,
resurfaces.
yeah, it does. So a lot of the in regards to, like, let's say for example, being supportive in me wanting to try different things, whether it was a different sport or learning a new instrument. They were always very supportive. There was definitely no limits when it came to that, my creativity and being able to kind of dive into see what truly like got my passion going,
Yeah,
right? um so in regards to that matter, like, I think it was awesome in how I was able to get involved in so many things from an early age, which led me to kind of truly find my passions, right? um but I guess some of the limiting factors came to play with just like seeing the dynamic between both them, fighting. And sometimes maybe as kids, we sometimes even take some of that blame, or we think it's
yeah.
our fault, or what could we do to prevent it from happening. So that's kind of how um part of my which carried on for decades. I'm 48 years old now, so like for a very, very long time. And some of this stuff I didn't even realize I was in my early 40s,
Wow.
right?
Like, is
That
it
that I
like
was carrying and I was
victim
suppressing.
mentality? Is that like victim mentality?
It was more like, so what happened in my early teens, my
Yeah.
parents started like the divorce
Yeah, yeah,
process, right? And in that process, I was old enough to kind of understand what
yeah.
was going on, and they confided in me a lot, right? I always
Mm,
kind of was that, with family and friends, I was like that listener, right? So they would come to me, and from both ends, right? So that's what kind
like,
of made it difficult, because I
what do
would
I
have like
do?
my mother, I would
Yeah.
have my father, so I would be stuck in the middle and then trying to
Ouch.
appease both of them, right? It's not an easy task. Um, but because of that, I became the listener, right?
Mm,
And I became pretty good at it. But as a consequence of that, I was suppressing a lot of my own voice, right?
mm,
And I took on that kind of like that role of like,
well,
okay,
parent.
I'm the person here who's going to listen to people's problems, right? Which is great. It's something that I have been passionate about, right? But little by little, I didn't realize that the more I put on, I
Yeah.
started carrying that weight on my shoulders too,
Mm,
and at the expense of my voice being very like drowned down, because I was like, no, my responsibility here is to listen to people and see how I could help them, and it's not
rather than
about
help
me and
yourself.
how they could
Yeah.
help me, or me reaching out for help, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like where that part of my childhood carried over to some of my adulthood, and me not being comfortable in a way with maybe even being vulnerable, which I think is something also that as men sometimes we experience, just because that's like a typical male thing. No, we have
Toxic
to be strong,
masculinity.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but aside from that, a major part of it was that like I took on that role, that responsibility of I'm the listener, right? I'm not here to voice my problems to people. I'm here to listen to people's problems and help them, you know?
What was going through your mind during that time?
At that time, I honestly, I saw it as a complete different,
Yeah.
from a different perspective than I do now,
Yeah.
obviously, right? So at that time, it was just kind of like, okay, how could I keep peace, right? So I'm getting obviously it was a pretty nasty,
Yeah. Yeah.
separation process that they went through. So it was very heated when it came to their emotions as individuals, right? Um, I didn't like to see that. I didn't like to see the fighting. I didn't like
Of
to see
course.
all that chaos, right?
Yeah. Of
So
course.
so the way that I perceived it back then was just like, okay, how could I be the referee who brings people to their corners, in a peaceful manner,
Yeah.
and not try to step on people's toes. Try to be the somewhat neutral, which is very difficult when you're dealing with loved ones that you care for a lot.
Yeah.
That they aren't getting along, but yet they care about you also, right?
To
But so
enough
you
to
form like
confine
a
you.
weird
Yeah.
triangle there, right?
Yeah.
So so at that time, that was my only concern. Is just like, okay, how can I keep peace? How
Yeah.
could how could I make this as smooth as possible? You know, and it really wasn't my responsibility.
No, it wasn't.
Now when I look back, it was something that should have never been my
Yeah.
responsibility. You know, but I think I took it on, and I think my parents at that time maybe they just didn't also realize how it was affecting me.
Yeah. Yeah. Most parents don't. It's just like, oh, just raising kids. Oh, it's simple, but they don't know like the all the.
It's definitely not simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess like the creative side. Can we talk about more of that? It was that like your escape from?
Part of it was, yes. And I've always been interested in different things, right? So I had like the sports or martial
Yeah.
arts. I was a huge Bruce Lee fan growing up,
Woo.
so I was always into like the karate movies, the kung fu movies, the ninja
Yep. Yep.
movies. So I was very into that. And then I started getting into music, and in elementary school, I just with the basic, learning to play the saxophone, like
Yeah.
that, like like the bands type of stuff
Yeah.
here
Band.
and
Yep.
there.
Yep.
Then
Band
I
class.
started learning to do the guitar, and eventually it led to a music career. I was I was a full time in the music business for almost 10 years.
Oh, okay. What
Yeah.
what were you doing?
I started out as an audio engineer, and
Oh,
then I had gotten into before I even graduated my college. I actually got into a pretty bad car accident, and that kind of put me in a new path, because at that time I was already working as a recording engineer in a studio in New York, and because of my accident, I couldn't sit down for long periods of time, right?
mm,
And obviously, when you're getting paid for
yeah.
clients, you can't just be like, "Hey guys, I need to take a break," and so that kind of like put a pause on that. But it led me, I still had the drive and the passion for music, so it just led me in a slightly different direction. So then I got into selling at that time. This was like in the mid 90s, late 90s. um DJs played vinyl
Oh, yes.
records,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I started an online business where I was selling vinyl to DJs across the United States. So they were mainly like import records that
Mm,
from Europe, and then we would sell them to DJs here in the United States. And then that led to a business partnership with one of my best friends, and it turned into an actual brick and mortar shop
yeah.
where we formed a record label. We started
Nice.
doing productions. We were doing remixing. We were DJing. Like everything that was
Living
involved
the
in the
life.
music industry. We pretty much covered it all. Yeah.
Living the life in your earlies.
Yeah. Yeah, that was in my early 20s. So it was definitely, this was before like digital downloads pretty much took over the industry.
Yeah, wow,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
And then after that, what was the other career? Was
So
the
so what
creative?
happened,
Yeah,
like because of the music
yeah,
and because we started seeing the changes that were starting to happen with the transition of physical medium for music, right? Whether it was
yeah.
vinyl or CDs over to a digital
Digital.
format,
Yeah,
because we owned the business, we used to sell the product, right? So we used to see the differences that were happening with our distributors, right?
yeah,
And then we started having companies reaching out to us, being like, "Hey, like Beatport was one of the first companies that hit us up, right? And they're known as the digital downloads for like DJs. So it's
oh,
a
okay.
great platform specifically for like dance music, right? And um, because I started seeing how the distributors that were very powerful, very busy, shipping tons and tons of orders across the country, and then all of a sudden, some of them were even expanding because their warehouse couldn't handle. So
Yeah,
they were handling, they were expanding to different warehouses to handle the load of orders, right? And then it went to like drastically, they were closing a warehouse. They were like laying off their staff. So we were very privy to seeing the back end of how
yeah,
the industry was changing, right? So what, every time when we, for our record label, every time that we would put out a release, right, we would send
yeah,
out promos, right? Physical promos to all the radio DJs, all
yeah,
the
yeah,
club DJs. And that's how you would get the word out there in the
yeah,
beginning, right? So what I got the idea once like this whole digital download came into my head and stuff was like, how about I do an e-promo, right? So um what I did, we had this huge mailing list, hundreds and hundreds of
yeah, yeah.
DJs, and it was very expensive because you had to like
Of course.
physically mail out the product,
Yeah.
right? So through email, I would reach out to these DJs and be like, hey, we have a new release coming out and we're going to send you the promos like how we always do, but you could get the new release right now because
Uh,
we have an e-promo. So we created a digital version, right? So they would get a link and there the which is all like common sense now, but at that
yeah,
time it was brand new. Nobody was doing this, right? So they would get like a page where they were able to download the MP3,
yeah,
right? Give us the feedback. They had like, a feedback form that they like it, whether we're going to support it or not. So a lot of them, were like, yes, this is awesome. We'll do this. And then they would just burn their own CD to go take it
uh,
to play it to the club or to
nice.
the radio station, right?
Like, it's like, welcome to the new age. New,
Yeah.
yeah,
So that led me to marketing because eventually other record labels started asking me, "Hey, who's doing this for you?"
yeah, yeah,
And I was like, "Oh, it's me." Well, like, "Can you do it for us?" I was like, "No, like, I don't have time. Like, I'm so busy with this. Like, I'm doing
yeah,
it for our own company, right?"
yeah,
But eventually, more and more people started asking, and I was like, "Hey, this is a pretty good idea. Maybe I should start it as a business." And that kind of led to like the beginning of the marketing business. So in
yeah,
2006, I started my marketing company, and it started out catering to music, but eventually it spread to everything but music, from like the construction industry to promotion. It became a search engine optimization business,
oh, wow.
so I would get people ranking their websites on the search engines. So
Yeah. And what was like the self-love kind of journey that made you want to become a coach?
all right, yeah, so um after like, and keep in mind, like,
Yeah.
like I said, from a very
Yes, yes.
young age in my teens, I always was somebody that people felt comfortable
Yeah,
speaking to, right? So I just started learning like that because I never really went to school for psychology, psychiatry, any of
yeah,
that. So a lot of this just like firsthand experience,
yeah,
just through years and years of dealing with so many people, and you start seeing patterns,
yeah,
right? So um what eventually I started realizing that no matter what the person needed to whether it was a personal development or personal growth or a challenge that they wanted to overcome, the root that helped anything that they wanted to achieve was if we could strengthen their self-love. It just became so much easier because it forms like a solid foundation for anything.
yeah,
So the stronger your self-love is, right? One, the more uh the more risk you're willing to take, right? Because you're like, hey, if I fail, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm learning, But when we don't have like a strong self love, we're not likely to do that because we put that like, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm not confident enough. And you put that like shame on yourself if you don't succeed, if you fail, right? So I started seeing all those patterns, and like no matter what a person wanted to achieve, and I was like, hey, if we fortify their self love, is going to help them accomplish any goal that they're trying to achieve. So that's kind of how it stemmed, and I was like, you know what, that's something that even myself, I've always considered myself a pretty confident person, but when I put myself to the test when it came to self love, I quickly realized that yes, I I loved myself, right? But there was still like
Like, what's
a
beneath that?
yes, that I was like, yes, I had somewhat of a foundation, and it was very superficial. It was very easy for me to be like, yeah, I love
Yeah,
myself. I'm confident, right? But
we
when it
can
came
teach
down to
others,
it,
but it's hard to do when you're doing.
yes, so that was something that I started working on for myself, and like it got stronger and stronger, and it helped me in so many ways. Like, cause I've always been kind of like a people pleaser, right? Just
Yeah,
because of how I
we've
grew
been
up,
there.
trying
Yeah,
to like please both sides of the equation when it came to my parents, and then that led into other, people pleasing, scenarios.
tendencies. Yeah.
Um, like once I was able to build my self love, it became easier for me to set healthy boundaries, right? It became easier for me to say no, because like at times it's just like, no, even if I hated what somebody was asking me to do, right? But it was just so difficult for me to say no because I didn't want to hurt them,
Yeah.
right? Or I didn't want them to judge me, like if I'm not a good person, right? And that's just a mentality that's just like, that stemmed from not having a strong and healthy self love. I just didn't realize that until I started actually practicing it, and all the pieces started to fall into place, So if that root is solid and healthy, it just it's like a beautiful domino effect. It's a ripple
Mm,
effect that just nurtures and nourishes everything else around
amazing. Wow. Wow. That's quite powerful insights.
it. Well, it took me a while to figure it out.
Yeah, I get that. And
Yeah.
in your own words to end off our segment, what would you say being limitless means to you?
Okay. Well, to me, I always love the concept of saying like, let's go back to when we were babies, right? Because when we were born, there were no
Yeah.
boundaries in our mind, right? It's like as we grew up, as we got older, that's when those blocks started to form around us, right? So to me, it's like just go back to our root of being a child, being born, where like if we wanted to like be a superhero, we became that superhero, right? We threw a towel on our back and we were like starting to fly. It didn't matter, right? There was no limitations of what we thought that we could or could not do, right? So to me, that is the feeling. It's such a powerful and empowering and a sense of freedom, right? That I think that a childhood mentality has, right? You and it's the reason why we start to become blocked is like for obvious reasons because it could be a little dangerous, right? If you think that you could like just all of a sudden like touch a fire and not get burned, like you're going to pay the
Yeah.
consequences. So
Yeah.
that's when like people who want to protect us start setting those like little blocks, right? Like no, you're gonna get hurt. But sometimes they carry over too far, right? Because maybe like a parent maybe was not gifted with a certain talent, right? And they're like, oh, well, no, nobody in our family is a musician, so you're never going to be a musician.
Yeah.
That type of scenario, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's when it gets carried over to like the parts where it's not like something of a immediate care, like, oh, don't touch that because you're going to get hurt, or don't touch that knife because you're going to get cut, that type of scenario, right? Um, so, but aside from that, like just the root of being a child and having our imagination is one of our greatest gifts. And I think that like as children, it was just the strongest, you know. And as we get older, sometimes our imagination starts to shrink, you know. So just being able to go back to that root to me is what makes us limitless.
Amazing, amazing. And where can our listeners and audience find you?
Marcelo Oleas is my name, and I'm on Facebook, Instagram, my website, YouTube. So yeah, just my you can find me under my name for everything.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.